Alright, so this video is entitled Why We Do Not Need a Law. First of all, law is essentially a hypocritical human institution. To presume that you can pass ethical judgment upon someone else basically means that you have to essentially be in some position of authority about what is good. But obviously, this would have to imply that human beings are intrinsically good, because nothing can arise if not out of nature. So for this reason, the establishment of a law is always hypocritical, because the establishment of a law also presumes that human beings are two things. On the one hand, they are stupid, so therefore they have to be told what to do. And on the other hand, they are evil or selfish, and therefore have to be told what not to do. Yet, why aspire to any sort of good if everyone involved in this enterprise is fundamentally prone to these two pitfalls, and therefore cannot attain the ideals that Aldous Huxley put forth for human progress? That is to say, that human beings are both intelligent and have goodwill. Obviously, this is a double standard created by people in power, which would explain its hypocrisy. Second contention. The law creates schizophrenia. All virtue essentially arises out of nature. It arises out of our sense of ethical indignation. When we feel something to be so adverse to the natural harmony that we seek to intervene so as to reestablish a harmony. Because as we know from physics, most of the universe is in a state of harmony, purportedly. Not to say that we would require physics for this. Physics can always attest to this theoretically. And this isn't by any chance, by any stretch of the imagination, lending an absolute authority to physics. This merely corroborates what has had actual empirical evidence in the experiences of Buddhists and Hindus and other forms of shamans, of everything being fundamentally harmonious. So how is it that disharmony exists? The classical religious question. Well, this harmony exists within small subsystems that have to be subsumed into a larger system in order to create greater harmony. Therefore, nature is always good, and goodness comes out of a relationship with nature. It comes out of the predominantly now unconscious sense of otherness, or thou, which is also indispensable in treating human beings with goodwill, genuine goodwill, not passive-aggressive goodwill or detached consideration. So the origin of goodness is in nature. The origin of goodness is in the unconscious, in the other. But the law severs the human being from nature by establishing the institution of the individual. This is an incredibly destructive institution towards the phenomenological growth of the human being. because it compels us to be consequentialists against our innate will. It also indoctrinates us by way of self-justification into a view of the world that is not natural. Human beings are born in a relationship to the world which is one of wonder and harmony. We see everything as manifesting its own soul in a sort of Platonic pantheistic way. And yet we are conditioned into a mechanistic view of the world, which is entirely arbitrary, which was established by the church and then taken up by Western science. And this view of the world, the mechanistic view of the world, is the worldview that increasingly begins to dominate consciousness at the expense of the human being's dream life and the human being's basic psychological health, which is, by any definition, a relationship to the environment as being fundamentally intimate and with no sense of subject-object division. Not in the technological sense, but in another sense. In the sense that while objects are perceived to be other beings, we are not divided from these other beings in any substantial way. So a split develops. If you cannot remember what you dreamt about last night, and even in remembering it, you cannot describe it, or much less account for its meaning, then there is a split between two aspects of your psyche, and predominantly your relationship to the world has been pushed into unconsciousness. Modern societies of control, as have been pointed out by Foucault and Deleuze, in fact, I can speak from this from experience, stringently restrict consciousness from attaining psychological health. Mythologies always aimed at the integration of unconscious symbols into conscious life in order to establish a psychological equilibrium with what is around us. And of course, as phenomenology pointed out, it's impossible to tell the difference between the mind and the physical world. The physical world itself may not exist. So there's no difference between a psychological equilibrium and a physical equilibrium. So for this reason, psychological equilibrium is absolutely necessary. It's necessary that we not operate in a mechanistic view that divides us from the world, because effectively, this means that we are actually, literally dividing ourselves from our environment, and we cannot survive in the absence of an environment once we become turgid and block ourselves off from resources. No more needs to be said on that, because phenomenologically, that's just the conclusion that would follow. Especially when we consider that all of our cognitive maps, according to which we would think that life would operate otherwise, are mainly structuralist and logocentric, and immediate experience, phenomenological experience, doesn't make the same divisive distinctions. Effectively, you might say that everything is energy. And synesthesia and phenomena of this nature are evidence that really all energy is essentially the same, whether it's perceived as being mental or physical, which is a really entirely arbitrary distinction in our fairly misguided Western metaphysics. So, in order that we may understand the unconscious mind, we need to dispossess ourselves of the egoism of the conscious mind. And that is a construct of the legal system. Because the legal system compels us to be held accountable for the past, even though the past itself is an abstraction. And therefore, we live a fragmented life, always thinking about the future, even though if there were any evidence that we'd have of the future, it would be entirely in dreams, especially in premonitions, which most of us within our lifetimes have. And again, there seems to be a greater psychological immediacy to these experiences than there is to the entirely arbitrary, abstract projection upon the future, which common sense reason seems to provide us with. Every mythological tradition in the course of human history, as far as I am aware, has taken into consideration the importance of vision, the importance of recognizing the future coming towards us as though we were observing a ship coming from the distance. Because, of course, the present comes out of the future. It's only Aristotle that might have insisted, ignorantly, that somehow the future could come out of the past, as though the wake of a ship drove the ship, to use Watts's analogy. But this is totally contrary to common sense. Of course, you're only governed by the past insofar as you allow yourself to be, and the past is an entirely arbitrary construct by which you try to explain memories. It's really, by any stretch of the imagination, non-existent. And I don't think that any progress can be made if you relate to the present in terms of the past. Why believe the past to push things into the present when it is already totally remote and doesn't have the quality to it of reality, in the way that something coming from the future, like a form of destiny, does. The third contention is obvious, that all of our social ills arise out of this kind of split thinking. Our sense of paranoia arises out of our replacing, for our immediate experience of things, a projection upon it of our structuralist constructs. Of our projection upon it our conceptions of the past, and our constant imposition upon ourselves of false senses of necessity, such as reason, such as logic, such as the law. I find it remarkable that in this country, in the United States, people do not recognize this. And I would be tempted to justify my own paranoia because of having had several generations of ancestors who were abused by a government. But I don't know that I can use that necessarily as justification. It itself seems abusive. But it seems that the institution of the law was put in place by people in power with the intent of dividing people from one another. And it works beautifully. Because so long as law is in place, people feel estranged from their environment, including from each other. And to resolve this cognitive dissonance, they adopt the law, they adopt the system, and use it against each other to perpetuate the cycle. But as Kafka said, no one has access to the law. There is no way that you can understand the law coherently in the way that you can from stepping outside, observing trees, understand them perfectly without any sort of cognitive dissonance, dividing you from them. Human beings are essentially good. But because we've lost touch with the environment, with our shamanic traditions, which are dying out all over the globe, be it the Native American, or the Aboriginal, or the Taoist, and because we have turned to technology in its place, we've effaced what it means to be a human being, which is to relate to another. And we've essentially deified the powerless individual and made that the narrative of one's life, even though unconsciously we clearly know this to be untrue. And it is precisely because our unconscious is in opposition to this dogma that it is oftentimes mystifying to us. But the symbols provided by the unconscious serendipitously, spontaneously, as opposed to by linguistic thought, those are clearly more adequate for describing reality in all of its phenomenological complexity than mere words. Words are entirely futile in describing felt experience, except by those with an incredible mastery of them, and even then it will always be somewhat of an absurd endeavor. It's still very enjoyable, especially since it can be used to indicate something which people, however, are already aware of. And I find it remarkable to what degree human beings in our society allow the law to infringe upon their freedoms, and allow a big brother figure to instate control. Take in California, anti-rape laws. Things like no means no and yes means yes. It was remarkable to me that people would not take any offense from a kind of big brother figure dictating for them sexual morality, as though human nature itself could not be trusted. As though a convention had to be legislated in one of the most intimate and visceral of human instinctive behaviors that still remains to us. Society and control and action. After all, can you not think of any reason why you would take offense to it? That a state would always assign a formal, state-based interpretation for any kind of language that you use, even though, of course, most communication is non-linguistic. We would have no way of learning language if we learned it from words. We learn it from something else. Probably by telepathy, by any stretch of the imagination, because after all, what is telepathy? Is it really that different when you consider it from how we actually communicate? course it's not. Words do not carry meaning. Jacques Derrida pointed that out to have been wrong a long time ago. And if words were the agent of meaning, how then would you explain, really adequately explain, not deny, shared dreams and premonitions, Sheldrake's telephone experiment, all this evidence that was common sense to human beings at an earlier time in history, that we are all connected, that any sense of intelligence must be dependent upon this series of interconnections. It's phenomenologically silly to deny the immediacy of such connection, simply because it does not line up with reason, which is really a linguistic construct. And given that, consider what Heidegger said about whenever we are cast forth into the nothing, when we're really confronted with a new experience, how we are tempted to turn it into something, how Terence McKenna said, when we encounter a new experience, we are tempted to describe it in terms of something old. And we are not to do that. You know, it makes one think about being a child. And how everything seemed to be have a teleological drive to it. You presumed education to be leading you somewhere. Why did we stop? Why is it that the child has been defined as something which is still developing, whereas the adult is not? Aren't we failing everyone, including our children, when we stop developing with that same sense of naive wonder? So think about it. No means no. Do you mean to say to me that a couple cannot communicate non-verbally? That the state must impose upon them language, which is just sometimes the most diverting of linear thinking, just the directed process. That human beings have become so severed from their intuitive capabilities that they cannot read each other perfectly. Do you mean to say that one must always have convention in order to seduce someone else, as though language itself were not a form of seduction, as though language itself were not something embarrassing, while being beautiful, as though there weren't a fine tradition carried on by the Huxley family, etc., of letting words go as being unimportant, despite their incredible utility. I mean, surely that would have crossed someone's mind, considering that all the mystical traditions of the earth say words are feeble, and even the endpoint of philosophy, which was Jacques Derrida, not to say that one can't go beyond him, but even at that benchmark, it was clear that language was constantly being deferred and could never really refer to the world. Is it not insulting, therefore, that the law would obligate one to use language in an intimate encounter, especially since an intimate encounter with anything other than a human being, such as a tree or a building, is always infringed upon by language. And we must exercise a sort of discipline in order not to fall into that when actually life reveals itself to us in those rare occasions that we actually still are sane. I mean, isn't this obvious? I mean, we go through an educational system that teaches us Thoreau and Heidegger and all these people, and de Beauvoir and Weil and all of these people, and Jung and Marie-Louise von France and the Huxleys and Watts. And how do we persist in allowing the law, this impersonal bureaucracy, which is a manifestation of everything essentially hostile or evil, to impinge upon that most personal of individual spaces? After all, it's not as though in the presence of the law, murder or rape or any of these things go away. In fact, it's the law that seems to create it. Because so long as people don't recognize their own human goodness, how can it be that they do not go mad? Uh, I mean, when you recognize the basic ethnocentricity of any kind of legal system, wouldn't it drive you mad to know that to the degree that you allow yourself to be a victim of it, you are a criminal hypocrite in the eyes of what would be called God or nature or maybe just yourself? Especially when you consider the kind of harmony that human beings must have lived in once, when they did not fear for their own survival, and the perpetuation of an individual, which was merely a construct of language and the legal system. And I'm not the spearhead of a revolution. These are just a few things which really deeply bothered me that I would like you to think about. Thank you.